Good afternoon, bon après-midi, and as we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I also want to take a moment to thank my friends and colleagues, Ministers Miller, MP Arielle Kayabaga, and PS's Jaime Battiste, and of course my Parliamentary Secretary Pam Damoff for joining us for this important announcement today, but also for the incredible work that they do representing their constituencies, and obviously as it relates to the substance of the announcement, which I'm about to come to, the work in advancing reconciliation and reducing overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples and racialized Canadians in our criminal justice system. Systemic racism is a harsh reality across Canada's criminal justice system, and the overrepresentation of Indigenous Black and racialized peoples is a symptom of this broader illness, as well as Indigenous peoples as well. That's why since coming to office, this government has advanced an array of innovative and progressive initiatives to address that overrepresentation. The goal is clear: to make our system fair and to make our communities safer. Le racisme systémique est une dure réalité dans le système de justice pénale du Canada. Et la surreprésentation des Autochtones, des Noirs et des personnes racialisées est un symptôme de cette maladie plus large. C'est pourquoi, depuis son arrivée au pouvoir, notre gouvernement a mis en place une série d'initiatives novatrices et progressistes pour lutter contre la surreprésentation. L'objectif est de rendre notre système plus équitable, mais aussi de rendre nos communautés plus sécuritaires. It begins with significant pieces of legislation like that introduced by my colleague Minister Lametti in Bill C-5, which takes direct aim at the harmful and in many cases unconstitutional mandatory minimum sentences regime that does nothing for public safety while disproportionately targeting Black and Indigenous peoples. It includes simple yet significant changes like cutting the fee for a record suspension, otherwise known as a pardon, from what used to be a significant $650 to down to just $50. For too many Canadians, especially Black and Indigenous peoples, a criminal record is a millstone around their neck. Cutting the fee means more Canadians can get pardons and to get on with their lives and to give back in a way that is positive. Qu'il s'agisse de s'attaquer aux peines minimales obligatoires ou de réduire les frais de réhabilitation afin d'aider davantage de Canadiens à reprendre le cours de leur vie, nous agissons. We are also supporting grassroots organizations who do incredible work on the ground. They ensure that we can address the systemic barriers by giving people every opportunity that they need to make the most of the opportunities that they have with additional skills, training, and experience that will advance their education and their careers. And it is exactly for those reasons that we are here today. Today, I am very proud to announce two initiatives to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and racialized peoples in Canada's criminal justice system. First, we are launching a new call for proposals under the Indigenous Community Corrections Initiative. The ICCI supports grassroots efforts that expand alternatives to custody and help Indigenous offenders reintegrate into their communities. Indigenous peoples account for more than 1/4 of prisoners. For women, it's roughly half the population, and in some regions, it is as high as 80 to 90% of the population in federal incarceration facilities. That is simply unacceptable. There are myriad causes, from systemic racism to the painful legacies of violence, neglect, colonialism, which leads to intergenerational trauma. And that's why we've committed over $5 million in federal funding to support organizations that offer culturally appropriate programming, training, communications, and more. The call for applications under this program is open until May 24th, and it will help to ensure that Indigenous offenders are able to get the kind of support that has at its core Indigenous language, culture, and history that will promote reintegration and reduce recidivism. Secondly, the Correctional Service of Canada is seeking expressions of interest from Black and racialized community groups, experts, or organizations that assist with reintegration. They're hoping to partner with those already doing the kind of fantastic work that they are already doing on the ground, and will invite them to apply until May 15th. Je suis très fier d'annoncer deux initiatives visant à remédier à la surreprésentation des Autochtones, des Noirs et des personnes racialisées dans le système de justice pénale du Canada. Tout d'abord, nous lançons un nouvel appel à proposition dans le cadre de l'initiative sur les services correctionnels communautaires destinés aux Autochtones. Deuxième, le Service correctionnel du Canada lance un appel aux groupes communautaires noirs, ethnoculturels et racisés, aux experts et aux organisations afin de solliciter des déclarations d'intérêt de la part de ceux disposés à favoriser la réintégration. Le service espère s'associer à ceux qui font déjà un excellent travail sur le terrain et les invite à présenter leur candidature jusqu'au 15 mai. These two initiatives build on the work that this government has taken very seriously since day one to modernize, reform our institutions as it relates to the criminal justice system so that we can reduce the overrepresentation of racialized Black and Indigenous peoples in our federal incarceration facilities. It is consistent with the principles of reconciliation. It is consistent with the principles of the Charter and consistent with the principles and values of this government that everyone should have an opportunity to achieve their full potential by giving back to their community in ways that are positive and will ensure that those communities are safe and inclusive. And with that, I will be happy now to turn it over to my colleague, MP Jaime Battiste. Merci. Thank you. Miigwech.
Gwe, walalioch, wildasi gishkuk, gistwell noch, jit oleganawadan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. I'd like to start off by saying I just want to recognize that today is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which the United Nations have been celebrating since 1966. I'm really happy to be joining Minister Mendicino and my colleagues today for a really important announcement. We've heard loud and clear from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we needed to do more in terms of addressing the over-representation of Indigenous peoples in our correctional facilities, and this is part of that action. We know, as Minister Mendicino has said, that in the overall correctional system, there are approximately 32% of that population are Indigenous. And we know that Indigenous women make up about 50% of those who are incarcerated within Canada. Indigenous Caucus has been talking to the minister, has been asking for action, and today we applaud that action that we're seeing from our government. We applaud the initiatives to ensure that we are doing our best to address the harms that we've created over many generations to Indigenous peoples with direct action today. I applaud Minister Mendicino for his efforts, as well as the Cabinet for taking this steps in these directions, and we're happy to stand as Indigenous Caucus Chair with my colleagues as we move forward on this, and I'm really pleased with the announcement we're hearing today and look forward to seeing what the improvements will be and the progress that we can create by helping to decolonize the justice system and to do more around Indigenous ways and Indigenous knowledge in terms of figuring out how we can make sure that we reduce the over-incarceration of Indigenous people. Thank you very much. And I'll turn my comments over to my colleague, Arielle.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here as well to join Minister Mendicino and my colleague MP Jaime Battiste to today's announcement. As we said, for many years, the criminal justice system has been characterized by an overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black people and other racialized people. The statistics prove this, and we know that it is not because of more crimes are being committed by these groups of people. And as the chair of the Liberal Black Caucus, I get to have the privilege of consulting Black communities across Canada on a regular basis. And one of the issues that we often hear about is the issue of Black people being overrepresented in the justice system. So we have to continue to address this issue. The issue of Black overrepresentation in our justice system is not new, and we cannot say the phrase justice is blind, because the reality of today, we know that it's not. And today's announcement directly addresses the need for a change and reflects our government's ongoing efforts to revitalize our justice system so that it is a fair process for all Canadians, including Black Canadians. That the Correctional Service of Canada seeking expression of interest from Black and racialized community groups, experts, organizations, to fight the overrepresentation by assisting with safe and successful reintegration is welcome. And it's a welcome announcement. We need the feedback and expertise and assistance from communities and organizations that not only have endured the system, but also have the knowledge and informed information from different members of our community. Donc, cette annonce que le Service correctionnel du Canada recherche des manifestations d'intérêt de la part des groupes d'experts ou des organisations de la communauté noire et racialisée pour lutter contre cette surreprésentation noire et racialisée en contribuant à une réinsertion sociale sûre et réussie est une bonne nouvelle dans notre communauté. Nous avons besoin des commentaires, de l'expertise et de l'aide des personnes pour nous assurer que nous avons un impact significatif sur le système judiciaire qui, nous savons, a tant impacté la communauté noire. The News of Indigenous Communities Community Corrections Initiative, ICCI, is just significant. Indigenous people represent too high of a percentage of the prison population in Canada, and a widespread issue visible in the detention center that serves my riding of London West. So this is also very welcome news in my riding. And we will continue to make sure that we're supporting all groups, including Black and Indigenous communities. Thank you.
And just before taking questions, perhaps I'll just ensure whether Minister Miller, you want to add anything, or and PS Pam Damoff? Okay. Questions, commentaires?
Minister, good to see you. The Premier of Ontario has been asked finally about the Rouleau report. These are the first words that Doug Ford has had about the convoy inquiry. If you wouldn't mind, I'll just read them to you and ask for your opinion. The Premier says that the idea the provincial government abandoned Ottawa is the furthest thing from the truth. He says the mayor of Ottawa and the police chief had their jobs. The Toronto mayor and that police chief had their jobs. And when the convoy came to Toronto, protesters did their job and they were gone. And that's all I'm going to say about the folks in Ottawa. They are now gone. It seems that the Premier is not taking responsibility for Queen's Park's role in the convoy and what happened with the security services of clearing the convoy. And as Minister of Public Safety, I'm asking you off the cuff, but I've got to ask you for your reaction, please.
Well, in the first case, I think we are very grateful to Judge Rouleau for having issued a report that not only validated the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act, which was a decision that we took only after careful deliberation and after having exhausted all of the existing authorities that were on the books to assist police in restoring public order, not only here in the nation's capital, but right across the country in various border communities, which at the time was causing significant disruption to Canadian jobs, to our economy, to our international relations, including with our most trusted partner in the United States. But in addition to doing that work and coming to the conclusion that it was reasonable for the government to invoke the Emergencies Act, Judge Rouleau also put forward a number of important recommendations, including how governments and police services alike can better cooperate to respond to the kind of ever-evolving threats to our public security landscape, including the very significant and unprecedented public order event that took place last winter. As it relates to the Premier and Ontario, as you heard me and other colleagues testify throughout the ordeal of the illegal blockades, We did maintain contact with the province of Ontario. There were lines of communication that were established throughout. There were definitely moments where there were challenges and pressures, in large part because these were exigent circumstances, exceptional circumstances. But through those challenges, we still found a way to make it work. And that has to be the bedrock of how it is that we keep our community safe, is that there is an expectation by Canadians that all governments work together to ensure public safety, and at no point was that more true than certainly last winter. So, en français, d'abord, il faut remercier le juge Rouleau pour son rapport qui a vérifié que la décision du gouvernement du Canada sur l'invocation de la loi de mesures d'urgence était une décision avec bonne raison, qui était raisonnable dans les circonstances de le blocage illégal. C'est seulement après beaucoup d'attention, avec beaucoup de réflexion, pas seulement au niveau du gouvernement, mais dans le contexte de toutes les consultations que le gouvernement a faites avec nos partenariats au niveau de provinces et territoires, y compris l'Ontario. Oui, pendant les blocages illégaux, il y a des défis, mais la raison pour les défis est la nature exceptionnelle de l'événement de l'ordre public, de sécurité publique. Malgré de tous les défis, on a préservé des lignes de communication avec Ontario, et c'est avec la coopération avec l'Ontario et tous nos partenariats, pas seulement dans le contexte gouvernemental, mais aussi avec les services policiers, qu'on avait restauré l'ordre sur le terrain. Et maintenant, on va étudier les recommandations de le juge Rouleau, qui a à la cœur de ces recommandations-là la collaboration. C'est la collaboration, c'est le principe fondamental qui est nécessaire pour garder la sécurité publique partout au Canada.
And just to bring supplemental, so you agree with the Premier of Ontario that Queen's Park did not abandon Ottawa during the convoy?
I think I was very upfront with Judge Rouleau when he asked during my testimony that there were definitely some challenges throughout through the illegal blockades, but that despite those challenges, there were lines of communication maintained between the federal government and the province of Ontario. I had conversations with the Premier, obviously the Prime Minister did, my colleague Minister LeBlanc did, and as a result of those lines of communication, we were able to see ourselves through what was a very difficult and unprecedented moment in our country's history when it came to the illegal blockades. What's most important is that out of the final report that has now been issued by Judge Rouleau, is that all levels of government, including provinces and territories and municipalities, study very carefully the recommendations which have been put forward by the judge so that we can strengthen the collaboration in the event of another similar type of challenge to our public order. And it is only through collaboration, governments working across party lines, or working across various levels of government, that we can ensure that we can protect our communities very safely. And in that, I am very confident.
I have a question for Minister Miller, if you don't mind.
Sure.
On behalf of my colleague Steph Taylor at the Canadian Press, she has a story out today based on some comments by Kimberly Murray to the Senate committee. And Ms. Murray was talking about one of the issues she's facing, hearing from communities that they're facing in terms of determining where unmarked graves are. And she says they don't have access to land. Private landowners sometimes are not allowing them to do surveys or studies. And she said that it keeps her up at night thinking about how things could escalate. So first, I'm just looking for your reaction to that.
Yeah, she's not inaccurate in that portrayal. There, in the places where residential schools were built, they were not all built on reserve. They were built on lands that are now provincial crown lands, and there is a whole story and quite a horrific story about the dispossession and the abandonment of the actual cemeteries that existed. So there's a corresponding collateral effect of years and years of disuse, dispossession, of those institutions. Some of them operated for 150 years or plus. Some only operated for a few years. The land has changed hands and is not necessarily under the control and custody of the Canadian government or in any Indigenous community in particular on the reserve. Noting that those institutions as well were places where children from dozens and dozens of communities were taken. So there's an immense amount of complexity in and around not only the control, care, custody, and securing of those locations, but the eventual next step when communities want to secure those areas, perhaps even buy them. And then in some cases, some landowners that don't want to give up that land or landowners that are seeing some opportunity in being able to jack up perhaps their purchase price of land where they see people wanting to acquire it under very, very difficult, painful, emotional circumstances. It should keep a lot of people up at night because it is a challenge. I've seen a lot of good faith though on the other hand, and a lot of people, there are a lot of people that have private landowners where these residential schools or even some of the burial sites are that actually want to cooperate and will work with the community that has the control and care and custody of the search to work with them. But they are not easy questions to resolve. Ultimately, they turn in and around the purchase potentially of the land, which the Government of Canada and typically the province in question will be willing to work with communities and the affected landowners. But there are potential conflict points, whether it's, and there are two in particular where these are currently being, where this is playing out, and it is of some concern to me, as well as it is to the special interlocutor. So there's a number of initiatives we can take: the outright purchase of the land and securing for the community in question. But in the face of an unwilling seller or one that is looking to perhaps extort or get really high value off a particular piece of land at the expense of people's emotions, and during a very difficult circumstances, we may have to take other measures in conjunction with the municipality or the province. But we're not there yet, and ultimately you have to believe in the good faith of people and sit down with them and negotiate terms and talk to them.
Would your government consider legislation to protect these sites from this type of thing occurring?
Yes is the answer. I think that's what we're looking to the special interlocutor to come back to us on. The nature and quality of these sites is and does vary across Canada, and there are provincial statutes and legislation that protect sacred sites. They are perhaps not treated as such, and there are measures that provinces can take. But I think at the end of the day, yes, we need to consider this type of legislation. There is analogous legislation that exists with respect to these types of sites in the U.S. It's not a perfect fit, but that's what we'll be looking at the special interlocutor for her recommendations on. Regardless of where these laws reside or where the jurisdiction resides, what's clear from what we're seeing is there is a heightened need for coordination on the legislative level, but also on the effective logistical level on the ground with communities that are looking for some answers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a question for Mr. Mendicino about today's announcement. Thanks. So what specific services do you hope that these grassroots organizations can provide?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I would say, first and foremost, having visited a number of our federal incarceration facilities, that I've seen the benefit of programming that has as its focus Indigenous language, culture, history, values, as a way of promoting reintegration into the community. Having spoken with a number of the inmates there, it is clear to me that this does reduce some of the barriers that are baked into the system as a result of the hangover of colonialism. And so the idea behind this program is to inject more resources and capacity to expand those types of programs right across the country so that we can see the rates of recidivism or reoffending come down, and by extension reduce overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black and racialized Canadians in our correctional facilities. The types of programs will very much be driven by the community itself. I mean, that is something else that I experienced in my visits, is that to a certain extent, after being built upon the values that I've described, they can be demand-driven. You know, there's flexibility. So it could be through expressions of career advancement. It could be through expressions of art and music. It could be through expressions of other extracurricular activities, which can ultimately build a sense of confidence and a sense of belonging and identity within one's own community. And I think that is, again, from where I sit, it's absolutely crucial to the success of this program, which is to place at its core the kind of language, history, and culture which I think has been neglected far too long in our programs.
For anybody on the stand, do you have a specific example of a organization that's been brought in that's seen success?
You want to go? Oh, well, we've got
All takers.
In 1990, they did a Donald Marshall Jr. inquiry in Nova Scotia that showed that there was systemic racism within the justice system that led to his wrongful incarceration. One of the recommendations that came out of that was the establishment of a Mi'kmaq legal support network so that people would be supported. And this is in terms of language, in terms of you being able to utilize the Mi'kmaq language when you're interpreting things in court. I've seen a great deal of success coming from the fact that Mi'kmaq people now had the ability to speak their own language and have that translated. A lot of my friends have the ability now to, who are translators in this system. So when we take the justice system, when we give the same opportunities to Indigenous people who are language speakers, give it with cultural sensitivity, the people that they know and from their own communities are supporting them through these difficult times, that we're seeing a greater deal of success in people not reoffending, the people that can possibly stay, you know, and do things within their culture. We've seen a great deal of success with the Mi'kmaq Legal Support Network. Their continued work with offenders is one example that I'd like to talk about before Pam takes them.
Well, you asked. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with Buffalo Sage, which is a healing lodge in Edmonton for women, one of only two healing lodges across the country for women. And they were talking about some of the programs that they would like to run for the women, but they don't have the resources for. So, you know, we can't give you the programs because we want this to be Indigenous-led. And too often, Correctional Services has done a one-size-fit-all program, especially during the Harper years, where everything was amalgamated into generic programming. So we want Indigenous organizations to come forward and Black-led and racialized organizations themselves to say this is what we see and this is what we feel. So it's not for us to determine what are the best programs, but I can tell you just from my conversations with Buffalo Sage, all of the women coming into their facility have had substance abuse issues. So getting treatment is a challenge for them because they don't get funding for that. So I think, you know, we will see what kind of programs come forward, but we have to make sure that they're Indigenous-led, Black-led, led by racialized organizations to ensure the success of the programs when people are released.
Mr. Mendicino, do you have oh, sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
No, that's fine.
Wanted to step up. Do you have a sense of how much funding, I guess, can go into this type of thing? Like, how much have you set aside, or will you be setting aside in the budget?
$5 million for the ICCI, as I said during my remarks, and I think that we're very anxious to announce similar funding for the programs that will aim to reduce overrepresentation when it comes to Black and racialized Canadians. And I just want to single out MP Kayabaga for her advocacy and her chairing of the Black Caucus. And I know together we're going to be able to see some concrete movement on that.
One of the things that was talked about a lot in the aftermath of that horrific stabbing in Saskatchewan in September was the need for the kind of supports that you're talking about within correctional systems, but also the need for supports within rural and remote communities, particularly Indigenous communities who simply don't have the kind of support needed for families or for communities to help with that reintegration. And so, you know, this being one step, you've heard for months now, you know what the issue is. I mean, it's not new. But you've heard for months now from that community in particular about that specific need. Is there anything happening to, you know, ensure that these communities can be involved in that sort of development and get the funding they need?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head in your use of the word community. It starts there. And I'm going to say a few brief words, and then I'm going to turn over to Minister Miller, because I know he's spent some time in James Smith Cree Nation. But that community is still reeling. Even though a number of months have passed, I met with them pretty recently, I'd say within the last month. They were here for a visit, and it is incredibly difficult to express the sense of loss and grief and tragedy, because the community is so small and related. And because of that sense of grief, I think the only thing that we can do as a government is try to support however we can. From where I sit, that begins by listening. And when you listen carefully, so much of the cycle of violence and loss and trauma has to do with the breaking of good faith between the government and Indigenous communities. And so to mend that wound, it takes a long time. I mean, you're right, it's not a new issue, but it is a very complex and arduous one to solve. And so there are things that I think that we are doing and that we need to continue to do to support a community like James Smith Cree Nation, that range from programs like the one that we announced today for those members of the community who have found themselves in the criminal justice system, so that they can be supported as they fulfill their sentences, with the kind of Indigenous-led programming that will see a successful reintegration into the community and help them stay on the right path. But there's other work too that I think is more, in my colleagues, Ministers Miller and Haidu's bailiwick as well, when it comes to making sure that there's the appropriate infrastructure. I mean, that was one of the things that I heard about when I was at James Smith Cree Nation last, which is they just need the safe and inclusive spaces. And I know that there has been some progress made on that front, but I think it has to start by listening and then respecting the values of their community, and all of this is work that we continue to do every day. I don't know, Marc.
I got a statement to QP, guys.
Yeah, he's going to do that. Yep.
Yeah, just a quick answer. I think the important thing to remember is that this can't be seen as operating effectively in a vacuum. We've talked about rehabilitation, reintegration, all these things that are very, very important to communities. Often we do hear from communities and their advocacy saying there are too many people that are incarcerated. There are too many women. The 90% figure in Saskatchewan is an ongoing tragedy. And for every woman or man, for that matter, that's in jail, that's a single family and a child that's then, as a consequence, taken into care. And that's a system that continues to be broken, that we are continually trying to reform. And we've put $40 billion on the table to repair to repair a system that needs to be fixed. And so if we look at this in a vacuum, and if we approach this in a vacuum, it's not going to work. Communities, as much as they support this advocacy and the work that's being done, they tell us continuously that they do not have the resources or capacity to re-welcome members into communities that have found, that have strayed and found themselves in jail. Sometimes unlawfully, but sometimes for a variety of reasons. But not attacking the root causes is not going to make this problem is not going to make this problem any better. And it's one that we have to look at in a more complete ecosystem than simply an announcement like this, which is very, very important because it is part and parcel of some of the work that's being done. But equipping folks and communities with their solutions and the work that my colleague Pam has been doing in meeting a lot of these advocates that have been often operating on a shoestring budget is very, very important to understanding this in the ecosystem that it actually lives in. And you'll hear that from every single community, that these initiatives are very good. We're moving on the right path, but they can't be looked at in isolation.
Real quick before you go, you mentioned that $40 billion. Where do we stand with that song and actually moving forward?
Yeah, so that's work that Minister Haidu and I are currently working with the FN, Caring Society Chiefs of Ontario, in negotiations. So there is that I can't speak to and publicly at this time, but it is ongoing, and there are negotiations that are ongoing. We're cautiously optimistic, and every day at the negotiation table is a positive step forward for us.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Merci.